This is the final in-person session of the 4 that I've set up for this teaching series, The Cross at the Center, the Faith of Lutheran Christians. And in the 2 mini lectures that I'm giving in this segment today, I want to focus on the implications of faith for Christian life. You may think, well, it's taken a long time to get where the rubber meets the road. But in some ways, I think we need to set ourselves up theologically and theoretically before we begin to apply the emphases of our own distinctive way of being Christians through the Lutheran lens to the way we live our lives collectively. Not just as we live them within Christian communities, within Lutheran congregations, but as we live them in the wider world, in a world of pluralism and diversity, where not everyone is like us, and certainly not everyone is Christian. How do you live a life that is Christian in focus in the midst of a diverse and pluralistic world where your assumptions are not shared by all your neighbors? What's the line between understanding the implications of faith for your own life and living them out in relationship with your neighbors, with the people next door, the people you work with, the people you've encountered in your life? Every week so far, we have returned back each time to the main title, The Cross at the Center. And I've taken that as an opportunity to remind you that God works in us and in our lives in ways that should free us. Should free us from fear and give us hope, and that are at the same time realistic about human limitations, that don't deny the reality of human sin and suffering, but understand that God is with us, both in our joy and in our sorrow. The way we understand God to work, God is with us in everything we do. And we turn to God in our sense of need, and God turns toward us to give us hope and calm, and then directs us back to the neighbor, because it is in relationship that we're intended by God to live. In relationship with one another, in relationship with the world around us, and living in the care for one another. We learn, of course, all about this in Scripture. That's where we get our first stories of God's long-suffering love for a fickle and fearful people. We learn about this in the teachings and example of Jesus as well. And we experience it in our lives together as congregations in the church, in our sacramental sharing, in our sharing of the bread and wine of the Eucharist, and in our common commitment to a belief in a baptism that unites us all in Christ. So today, the turn that I'm making is toward what it means to live together. How is it different to live as a Christian, embedded in a family, as part of a Christian congregation in the church? And what does it mean in the wider world of all kinds of people in which we have to move and with which we have to deal in our pluralistic society? So what does it mean to lead a Christian life, to live as a Christian? Is there really even such a thing as a Christian life? And how do we go about actively loving God and loving our neighbor? In Martin Luther's time, it was widely believed that the whole of human life was a struggle to manage one's own sinful nature and sinful inclinations, and to try to live in such a way that at the end of one's time on earth, one would have done enough good to have pleased God. Because in that way of thinking, a God-pleasing life would have as its natural reward an eternity in God's presence, in the company of all the others who had pleased God too, all the saints of every time and place. And so reaching this goal of eternal reward was the goal of every Christian's life. In Luther's time, it seemed to many like some had a kind of fast track, an inside track to this kind of God-pleasing life. because they were able to live intentionally Christian lives based in promises that they made to God in front of the community, and who therefore were set apart for a different kind of life than the rest of us, than the rest of ordinary lay people. There was an actual professional class of Christians, monks and nuns and all the different orders of priests. They were the ones who were seen as the people whose whole lives were organized so as to help them reach both the goal of closeness to God in their daily lives, and also prepare them for the reward of salvation in the next. People who had made promises to God to live in a particular way, without fail and complete consistency until their dying day, lived in the assurance that this was pleasing to God, and that they would indeed be rewarded as every Christian wished to be. And in the process, they had the advantage of not being distracted by their work or their poverty, or even from their own selfish inclinations, from being the kind of heroic believers that the church system of the time set them up to be. Now, of course, if you believe that every monk and nun and priest in the Middle Ages was an especially holy person because of that, you would have been laughed at the time, and Luther himself makes fun of monastics who are full of their own self-righteousness, but whose lives, in fact, are no more Christian than that of anyone else. And I repeat this not to make fun of them myself, but to say that all of the human attempts to remove people from the temptations of daily life and put them into an especially holy place where they could cultivate a closeness to God that was greater than that other people could enjoy, all of these attempts have, over time, in one way or another, failed. There are, of course, heroes of the faith in every age, but they are not necessarily the people who were set aside by the promises they made to live in a different way than others. But those who were able to internalize and show forth a Christ-like life to such a high degree that their neighbors understood it. The professional religious of Luther's time lived mostly for the purpose of prayer, because their prayer was seen as a constant gift to God. And in a sense, because they had the freedom to do it, they were doing it also as a gift to those who weren't able to, who didn't have the time or the patience or the words to pray. The professed religious, monks and nuns in particular, had taken vows to pray at intervals every single day, through the day and through the night, with some of the prayers happening in the darkest time of night. They did this every single day, every day of the year, from the moment they entered the communities in which they did this until they were no longer physically able to do it and were ready to die. This was a life, the life of a monk or a nun in the Middle Ages. Times of prayer punctuated by times of work. And this was considered the best way for a person to live a Christian life. Obviously, not everyone could do it, but for those who had the leisure and the education and the backing to be able to afford a place in a monastery, could depend on a pretty safe and secure life, except that they were devoted to this one activity, which I think for most of us would have seemed mind-numbingly repetitive. And also enclosed together, forced to live with the same group of people, engaged in the same activity for the rest of your life. The only relief being occasional new ones who would join and occasional old ones who would die. This was the way that many Christians thought Christian life ought to be. And it was the most perfect kind of life one could have. One was removed from the temptations and challenges of having to live an ordinary life where you had to fend for yourself, shift for your food, take care of your family. Everything in the monastery was taken care of for you Others were responsible for the roof over your head and the cooking of the food, although you might have to take a share in the chores. And indeed, in most monastic houses, there was a principle of humility, which meant that everyone took a turn at even the menial work that had to be done to keep life going. But no one was responsible for it except the people in charge of the monastery. They were the ones who managed it for everybody else. So it was a particularly rarefied way of being Christian. And even those who couldn't do it often emulated it themselves. One of the ways in which religious practice gets intensified in Luther's time is through lay people taking on the religious practices of monks and nuns on a voluntary basis in their own homes, in their own lives, committing themselves perhaps not to every single prayer all the way through the day and through the night, but to some of them, the ones around mealtimes that were easier to remember. Maybe making some promises to do good deeds, to give alms to the poor, the kind of pious practices that the church encouraged, fasting on special days of the year, all the things by which one could show in an external way one's commitment to one's faith, were encouraged by monastic orders of people who were essentially their hangers-on. You could join an organization, which was sort of like the Friends of the Order of St. Benedict, and then by paying a small fee, you'd get a medal to wear around your neck, and the obligation would be to join the monks and the nuns, wherever they happen to be, in this prayer by doing it yourself at home. A little bit like television ministry today, just without the television. And that this was a way that people felt like they were participating in that kind of extra special Christian life. We know that Luther was a bitter critic of all of this, to the degree that it gave people a false sense of closeness to God. He believed our access to God was only through faith, through grace, that in fact it was God who bent to us to give us faith. And no amount of working at it, no amount of trying hard to say the right prayers at the right time would bring us closer to God, apart from God's own desire to be close to us, shown to us in the life and death and teaching of Jesus Christ. And so Luther believed, and he experienced this himself, that the monastic life was not enough, that it seemed to him a hollow kind of promise, devoid of the living faith he thought necessary. And so he critiqued it and said that monks and nuns get no closer to God through their vows than any Christian would who tried their best to love God and love their neighbor. That it wasn't a matter of rule keeping. It was a matter of understanding what God had done for you. In this, we go back to the earlier lectures in which I talked about the basis of our faith being our conviction that God has acted on our behalf through Jesus Christ and does not need our doing something in return in order for this to be effective. It's quite hard enough for us simply to accept that God has loved us first. It's easier, in an ironic way, for us to think we need to do something now in response than it is to believe that we don't. Because to believe that we're completely dependent on God's grace leaves us sort of alone, leaves us without a response or an answer to God, except to say, yes, thanks. And to then try to figure out what the next move in our life will be. Luther, I think, didn't fully realize when he started teaching about the Christian freedom from the law that he was setting Christians quite as free as he was. And it is a freedom with which I believe we are still not comfortable. Any individual among us, sometimes even as a church, although as an institution, as a way of thinking and looking at God, Lutherans have practiced the idea of grace alone and faith alone so much that they are slogans firmly written in our hearts. But even so, it is a challenge for us to actually believe them. That the promise of God, the ultimate promise of God, which is that God has loved us and that therefore we need nothing but to know this love, is in some ways a really, really hard challenge for us to accept. It would be a lot easier to say, well, if we only prayed 5 times a day and only did certain things on certain days of the week and could know our own faithfulness through our ability to keep our own promises, that would in some ways be more reassuring for many of us, even now. But Luther takes it away and argues that monks and nuns, far from actually achieving anything, were getting in the way of their own salvation by piling up false ideas of good deeds that weren't really good at all, and that their attempts to pray for the world were in some ways just selfish, a selfish activity to give them a greater reassurance of their own salvation, and that they were building their house on sand, because humans are not constant in their affection or their faithfulness or their loyalty, that we're constantly in motion, constantly dependent on hearing God's promise again and again. You know how much Luther was nagged by doubt. How could one ever please a God who was perfect if one could not be perfect? And this in a way causes him to rethink the entire sort of structure of how salvation and Christian life work, and moves them away from being about being something, being pure, being faithful to promises, leading a holy life, and toward service. That the way we understand our Christian life to be lived out, in gratitude for God's yes to us, is to say yes to each other, and to then help each other as the other needs help. This is really challenging. It's the basis, from our Lutheran perspective, of all Christian ethics. Doing the right thing means doing the right thing for someone else. We have spent a lot of time thinking about what God wants us to do, but it really can be simplified to the great commandment, to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus doesn't say, love God in these particular ways, by keeping the Sabbath, by honoring your father and mother, by all the traditional ways that the people of Israel had come to understand God's commands to them. Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are almost one action, I think, at least the way Luther understood them, that to do the one is to do the other. You don't love God first, which is in a way what the monks and nuns were thinking they were doing, spending their whole lives living without someone to love, living without the potential of having a family, knowing that you would die, essentially alone, even if you lived in community, and spending your entire life engaged in prayer was seen as a way of loving God first in order that you would be freed up for a love of neighbor. But it never quite gets to the second step. It still is essentially a selfish activity, trying to manage one's own sinfulness. The penitential system that Luther inherited, and that with some modifications we still maintain within our Lutheran tradition, believed that constant self-examination is part of the Christian life, that we should be self-critical. We should not be complacent about our own weaknesses. Because in fact, left to our own devices, we will do whatever we want. And it is often the sense that we are being called back to a better life by Jesus that helps us modify our behavior in ways that we can live with. Luther didn't think that simply knowing that God loved you was going to end all your problems, was going to remove all your doubts and your temptations, and suddenly you would no longer be addicted to the things that enthrall you or drawn into selfishness. Those are natural. Those are part of what is inborn into every human. And they remain, for Luther, as for us, a struggle. But what Luther believed is that built on the daily reassurance of the promise of God to have loved us, we can try to rise above those every single day. In his 1520 treatise, The Freedom of a Christian, Luther talked at some length about what he believed faith in God and trust in God's promise does for a Christian individual in terms of freeing them from a false sense of self, freeing them from a false sense of obligation to rules they don't need to keep, and liberating them, in a sense, for a kind of constructive life lived in service to others. The way he puts it in that treatise, which is a short and relatively simple but very complicated abstract one, is by positing two contradictory statements. You know, I mentioned before that Luther liked paradox. And so for two things, apparently contradictory things, to both be true at the same time is a very typically Luther way of getting at a divine reality. And he does it in this case too by saying that on the one hand, a Christian, because the Christian has been liberated by God from compulsion to any particular act, because God has saved us as we are through free gift, that a Christian is a perfectly free person and subject to no one at all on earth. There's nothing another human can do to you to take away the promise God has made to you. That is absolute. And so in that regard, you are a totally free Lord of everything on earth. Each one of us, however limited our own capacities, has that intrinsic freedom. So that's statement number one. The paradoxical and opposite statement follows, that a Christian is always a perfectly obedient servant of everyone, subject to everyone else. Luther even uses the word that we could translate as slave. So on the one hand, one is totally free in regard to the freedom God has given that cannot be touched by other humans. On the other hand, one is meant to live here as a human, among other humans, living within the context of other humans' needs and subject to care for others. So a perfectly free Lord and a perfectly dutiful servant at the same time. When I teach this to undergraduates, or used to teach this to undergraduates at Cal Lutheran, they would say, "What kind of freedom is that?" Didn't sound very free to them. For them, freedom was a full tank of gas and no place to be. And it isn't actually a stringless freedom. It is a freedom that is a freedom within the framework of obligation. Because Luther is recognizing two absolute human realities. The one, that we need God and we depend on God for a saving word, and the other is that no person is an island. Nobody really lives alone. Even people who decide to turn themselves into recluses or hermits still aren't really alone. They're living in reaction to the people they don't want to see. That we are all caught in a context and a framework in which our lives on earth live out, but at the same time, those lives are lived out under the eye of God, in a sense, because we are all children of God. And what Luther is trying to do with this complicated idea is to move us out of one kind of simple-minded obedience mindset into one that is more complicated and more productive, because it involves both agency on our part and responsibility on our part for where we find ourselves in the world. These are two ideas I'm going to use a lot, two concepts I'm going to say more than once. You may get tired of them. Agency, which is the capacity to act based on the abilities that we are given and the situations we are in, and responsibility, acknowledging the consequences of that agency, because none of us actually lives alone, but we live in constant connection to other people. What Luther was trying to say, really at its root, is that Christian freedom is a freedom from the fear of failing God, by failing to follow the rules of the church. And to the degree that Christian life had been defined by Christian leaders as being about following the rules of the church, they were wrong. And that in fact they were distracting people from the main point, which that God has liberated us to serve one another, not to follow the rules of the church. That all sounds well and good if a little high-flown, but I'm convinced that every one of us, every human who ever was or ever will be, is in some degree in love with the idea of law and obeying the law and law and order. I think it's hard for us to imagine the kind of freedom that Luther talks about in Christ. So we make up laws for ourselves. We think of ways to be obedient. And of course, we've used our faith, our religion, to do this time and time again. The scriptures are full of laws. Levitical laws have over 600, varying from very general to very specific ones about what kind of skin conditions make it impossible for one to associate with another human being, the kinds of foods that can be eaten, the combinations of things that can be worn, all kinds of laws that the people of God established at times in the past because they gave them a sense of security that they were doing what God wanted them to do, and therefore would belong to God most certainly because of their obedience. And I think in many ways we still do this. The Ten Commandments, which Luther valued very highly, his small catechism is based on the Ten Commandments. These are the laws in which the whole Levitical law was digested into 10. And then, of course, Jesus' great commandment is a direct allusion to that as well, by taking the 10 commandments and reducing them down to one, to love God and one's neighbor. In a way, all of this is a testimony to our great desire to nail things down, to figure out exactly what God wants in order that we can know for sure that we have done it right. How reassuring that is. I know not every personality is the same, but I know that when I was growing up, rules were very important to me. In fact, there was nothing more important in my life than rules. But I couldn't decide from one moment to the next whether I hated them or whether I loved them. Because on the one hand, as an adolescent and a young person, you want to break every rule that anybody else gives you. Kind of by definition. Somebody says no, you say, oh, how am I going to get to do that anyway? But at the same time, you also live in a very uncertain world, full of dangers and unclarity. And having rules is reassuring within that. I mean, many of you have raised children, and you know that even the very same child who defies your attempt to enforce a rule craves the structure that a loving set of rules gives within a parent-child relationship or within a family. We all have this complicated relationship with law. And I think that's reflected all through scriptures. Moses setting the people back on the path with the 10 Commandments, the way the Levitical laws define belonging to the people of God. Luther even does that with the 10 Commandments in the Catechism by reinterpreting, by turning them upside down and making them not so much a matter of what you shall do, but a matter of how to understand yourself in relationship to others. On for example, the commandment not to kill. Luther doesn't waste any time saying that obviously you should not kill, because he takes it for granted that that's something that humans shouldn't do. What he does in a very challenging way is to expand the definition of killing to include keeping people from the livelihood they need, gossiping about them and damaging their reputations in the minds of others. All the ways that we do little murders, that we damage other people with something less, of course, than homicide, but something that is still evil and still wrong. We diminish others to make ourselves greater. That's what Luther means by a violation of that commandment. And he does this with all of them. He expands them to be a lot more than they are on the surface. Because what he's trying to say is this is not about pleasing God by following some absolute rule. This is about relationship with one another through our lives in God, our lives of vocation. Here's another technical word that Lutherans like to use, vocation. In the technical religious language that you would see if you look this up on Wikipedia, you probably would get vocation come up most frequently as a specialized term within the Roman Catholic tradition for those who feel the special call to ministry as a priest or as a nun or a monk, those people called into the professed religious state. Vocatio in Latin really means a call. You have been called. Luther expands this vocation, this idea of vocation, to include every single Christian, not just clergy people. Every one of us is called to something by God. It might not be clear exactly what that is. Our calling might not be the same as a profession, although it might be. People who are called to be teachers or nurses, or there are many ways in which the kind of work we do relates to other people directly. Some people are called primarily to be parents. Some people are called to work in government to help our society function better. There are as many different kinds of calls as there are people. Even as Luther would say, even the skill of making good shoes for your neighbor gives a shoemaker a holy calling. And one kind of calling is not better than another, even though it might enjoy more status in society to be the mayor than it would be to be the cook in the tavern. Nonetheless, they both have functions that society needs. And from God's perspective, when they do their work carefully, conscientiously, and with care for other human beings, they're both living out God's intentions in their very different ways. This is one of the things, for example, that if you are a student at an ELCA college or university, you end up learning about, whether you like it or not. And usually in the required freshman religion class, but also in other places as well. It's reinforced within the community of the university that the purpose of education, in part, is to help us find how we are meant to help others. And then to help us develop the skills that we need to do that in a way that is meaningful to us and effective for those around us. So, in a complicated way, where I've been trying to lead you in this, is to the point that leading a Christian life, from Luther's perspective, is a complicated blend of freedom and responsibility. That on the one hand, we live our all too short human lives reflected in the mirror of eternity, knowing that this life is not all there is, that God has called us to an eternal unity with God and offered us life forever in Jesus Christ. But knowing that the way we live our lives is our responsibility, and that we are called to live not as islands of individual piety, but as interacting parts of a complicated society in which we live out from day to day some mortal version of the death-defying love that God has shown us in Jesus Christ, and which gives us security not to fear our own death, but puts us in God's picture as well. God holds us tighter than any human feeling, and God's love holds us more securely and for longer than any human life. But while we're in these lives, we're given some work to do, and that is to take care of one another. I'll end with that for this moment and give you an opportunity for questions and reactions. Those of you who are on the live stream, there are a set of questions in the first section of the sheet, and you should feel free to discuss those. Anyone here in the room want to ask a question, they may. There's also an opportunity, I understand, to ask a question remotely.
when does freedom become selfishness?
Yes. When does freedom become selfishness? That's a deliberately provocative question. That's the professor in me, can't resist. What do you think? Anybody have a thought? When does freedom become selfishness?
Well, I think to answer that question, it's important to ask a couple of other questions. And if the question about oneself is what would Jesus do, and what if everyone else did this? It might not seem like a big impact if just I did it, but what if everyone else did the same thing? And then question about others. What if I looked at things from their perspective, and how would God respond to this person who he loves?
Yeah. The answer there's no one answer to this, but the reaction that we heard was to try to see others as God sees them, which I think is a very important way of doing that. A much more common one in our culture is to think about what it would be like if we all could live and act as Jesus did. I've always been a little skeptical of what would Jesus do, because I always feel like should be an asterisk there that is, what would Jesus do if Jesus were me? And if Jesus lived right now in this setting, confronting what I'm confronting. Because in some ways, we can't really go there. The what would Jesus do is for us witnessed for forever in the scriptures, and talk to us again and again. This coming Sunday's gospel lesson on the story of the merciful Samaritan is a wonderful example of Jesus giving us an indication of what Jesus thinks we should do, even if it isn't really a story about what Jesus did. So let's talk a little bit more about freedom and selfishness. Is freedom ever free of selfishness? Yeah.
I think it's free of selfishness when it's used for others, but I think freedom becomes selfish when everything you do is based on yourself. You're the center of everything.
Yeah. To the degree that freedom is used for others, it is not selfish. To the degree that freedom is used for one's own sake, it is selfish. Now, I set out two ends of a spectrum. This is, artificial thinking, because things aren't really linear. But let's use that for a moment. So, entirely for the benefit of others is selflessness. Entirely for one's own benefit is selfishness. Where do our acts fit on this spectrum? Usually in between, comes the voice from the back, which is entirely true. Sometimes more on one half of the line, sometimes more on the other. The same act can be at different times, in different places, under different circumstances, in different places on the spectrum. Luther would have said that to do good deeds out of the fear of damnation is a spiral, a downward spiral of selfishness that can only lead to hell. That's a very dramatic medieval way of putting it. But what Luther would be trying to say is there's nothing that you and I can do as humans that is free from the taint of selfishness. We just don't have that part of the spectrum. We can't go there. That's for the super people, the ones who've already died, and don't have to worry about their selfish inclinations anymore. And that all the rest of us deal with the selfish part, to one degree or another. That sounds a little bleak, but it's just meant to be challenging.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a hook we never get off of, I think, in this life. But the thing is, life is not about the hook. Life is about the promise of a hookless life in Christ that is offered to us through Jesus and his cross, where the worm and the hook are long gone, and that we are dealing with an entirely different way of being God's own people, free of all the selfishness. Yes.
I was just thinking the world sees freedom as saying whatever's on your mind, no matter how it hurts people, pushing edge, getting what you need for yourself. And that's a kind of misnomer of freedom. And we see freedom in a completely different way as honoring people instead of, the freedom to put ourselves aside and think about others. Such a dichotomy all the time to struggle with.
Yeah, the reaction was that the kind of freedom that I'm describing, this kind of Christian freedom, it's a lot harder, a lot less self-indulgent. There is a lot in the world that tells us, yeah, you ought to do that. You deserve it. Drink that glass of wine. Whatever it is that the commercial is trying to tell you, buy that car. You're worth it. And in some ways, I don't think there's anything intrinsically bad in having a sense of self-worth and value, as long as we understand how far we are from perfection, and that we don't allow the pursuit of self-worth to distract us from the need to distract us from the real source of worth, which is found in caring for someone else. Any of you, and I'm sure there are several in this room, who have been engaged in what we would consider caring professions in your lives, as teachers or nurses or physicians or anybody who gives care to others in a time of need, social workers, all kinds of ways in which this is done. Even, I think, in some cases, people who work in food service and people who work even as lenders can be carers in a sense that they're helping people do what they need to do in life. All of that, that feeling, that to make a difference in a positive way in the life of somebody who is afraid or uncertain or in need is a powerfully good feeling. And we don't do it just because it feels good. We do it because we know it's right, but it doesn't hurt that it feels good. And to the degree that that feeling helps remind us that there is a God who loves us, and that the ultimate good feeling is knowing that we have a God in whom we can rely. To the degree that all these things can work together in our hearts, we're better off for it. It's just that we're never completely removed from the danger of self-centeredness. I think that's one of the insights of Martin Luther that is the most useful for us, in fact, because it keeps us modest. Yeah, Steve.
There was a TV show that I watched probably about 20 years ago, and the whole half an hour plot was centered around the characters trying to find an act that was purely selfless. And it really stuck with me because they really had a hard time. You give $1 to the homeless guy, and it gives you a good feeling. So is that purely selfless? You work at the soup kitchen or the dog shelter, volunteering, and it gives you a good feeling. So is that purely selfless? And it's made me think about that.
Yeah, I don't know if all of you could hear Steve, but he pointed out that in this case, a plot theme in a story was the search for a selfless act, and how challenging it is to find such a thing. One of the things about that is that the pleasure that comes from doing good is an end in itself. There's nothing wrong, ever, with doing good. It's just that we shouldn't think that it's something that it isn't, which is it isn't making God happy in a way that's going to make us more loved by God than we were before. We were already loved that much. We just might need to remind ourselves of it by doing reinforcing activities. So, there is another show that Rob knows better than I do called The Good Place. Have any of you seen that? What's it on? Where do you see it? Is it on Netflix? Netflix. Anyway, it's a show, the whole premise of which is that you gain points in life for doing good, and you lose points in life for doing evil, and whether you go to the good place or the bad place after you die depends on your score. This is basically a modern reworking of the medieval understanding of sin and penance. but it's actually, I really hated this show for the first 2 or 3 episodes because it seemed to me so crass. But of course, like any good show, it immediately starts making itself more complicated. So that eventually you're not entirely sure which is good and which is bad. What kind of points are being kept? To what end? How is a person who knows herself not to belong because she knows how bad she is, what's she doing there? What kind of mistake had been made? And so the implications are very thought-provoking. It becomes a show that actually, I think, has some depth, or at least it's kind of a brain tease about morality. So, although I would not say that it presents a Christian view of the afterlife. And it's hilariously funny. With Ted Danson as kind of the head angel or whatever. So, any more questions? Well, let's take a break for a few minutes then. For those of you who are remote, we'll start again at straight up 1. For those who are in the room, it's a chance to have a drink or use the restroom, and we'll see you back in a few minutes to talk about the further implications of Christian life.